presentation. So you can go ahead, Max and Chris.
Hi, everyone. You want me to start? Yeah, cool. All right. So hi, everyone. We're here. We're going to be presenting on academic equity through trauma-informed practices, making repositories sustainable for researchers with lived experience. And we're going to be sharing a little bit more about ourselves in just a moment. I know that some of you may be coming here with some questions like, what do you mean trauma-informed repositories? Why does this matter? Is this really even a thing? And so I just want to encourage you to bear with us. We're going to lay out a little bit about what we mean by that and why it's important, why we think it's important, and then we're going to move into some of the specifics and logistics of like what that might look like in practice. What we're going to do today as an overview is just make sure we talk about what trauma is. What does trauma-informed mean? Why is it an equity issue? We're hearing a lot of push in academia for equity and how do we involve impacted populations in research and study that's about their identities and their communities. So we believe trauma-informed is an essential piece of that understanding. And then we're going to get into specifics of how to incorporate a trauma-informed lens into your repository.
And I know that lots of y'all are probably doing projects that will relate to some of the issues that we'll be talking about, even if maybe at this point you don't realize that they're connected. And so I'd love it if you would share those that information and links to those projects in the Slack channel.
Cool. So this is us, and I'll tell you who I am. My name is Chris Ash, and I don't have anything to do with software development. I actually work full-time at a day job in sexual violence prevention, funded by the CDC. And then in my free time, I do a consulting practice where I work with national anti-trafficking organizations on projects, including projects around survivor leadership and involving impacted populations with national initiatives like Freedom Network USA, Heal Trafficking, the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and the Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign.
And I'm Max Cadle. I'm a software developer with data curation experts, and I'm also really excited to be, next week, I will be shifting to be the tech lead for the Carolina Digital Repository at UNC. And I also have a lot of experience as a cataloger and reference librarian, so I'm bringing both of those pieces together. And my pronouns are he, him.
And my pronouns are they, them. And we are presenting currently from Carborough, North Carolina, where we know we are on land that has traditionally been taken care of by the Shakori and Eno people. And we want to acknowledge that we're on that land and that we are in relationship with that land and that we want to respect the work that's been done to care for it and that we want to continue that relationship.
And Chris shared this excellent land acknowledgement with me from Adrian Wong, specifically for situations like this where we're all in different pieces of land, many of which are were originally indigenous lands. Or have had historical indigenous caretakers. So I just want to acknowledge that even though we may be meeting together in sort of a digital realm, we are still affecting the land that we're on. We're using resources. And so I'll just quickly read this land acknowledgement by Adrian Wong. Since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let's also take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technology, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect indigenous peoples worldwide. I invite you to join us in acknowledging all this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship.
So we're going to start by just talking about what trauma is. And I know a lot of times people think that trauma is a memory, that it's just like a logical or rational memory of something that happened that went wrong. But it's a little bit more than that, because trauma is something that happens in the body when we experience an event that overwhelms our capacity to process it in that moment, or in which we're not able to keep ourselves safe. So it's a physiological response, not a rational one. It can be to an incident, to repeated harm, or to oppression, living under oppression or racism or colonization or misogyny or transphobia and queerphobia. Those are traumatic experiences that have this constant buildup. Sometimes I tell people trauma can be having a boulder dropped on you, but it can also be being pecked to death by chickens all day, every day. But it's a physiological response. So when we're talking about what a trigger is, we're not just talking about some rational choice to be offended by something. What we mean is that in our past experiences, when we feel unsafe, our nervous system floods our body with these stress chemicals, these fight or flight chemicals. And when we can't fight or flee, we end up freezing to tolerate whatever's happening and find a way to survive. It's a great survival strategy that keeps people alive, but it's not a way to live long term. And yet it has long-term effects on how our bodies navigate fear and safety, which means that in the future, you might be in a situation where you experience a trigger, which again doesn't mean that you're offended or that you're having a thought or a memory, but it means that something, whether it's an image, a story, a smell, a sound, something that you experience reminds you of this past trauma that you experienced. And because your body has lived with this dysregulated fight or flight system not working and not being able to keep you safe for so long, in that moment of the memory, all of a sudden your body floods with these stress chemicals again, and you are activated as if you were actually looking at the bear, even though there may not be a bear right in front of you. Which means there's ways to do things to reduce the likelihood of that happening or to mitigate the impacts when that does happen to people. And so we call that trauma informed. There's also a lot of really great work on healing centered. To me, those are not in opposition to each other. They dovetail nicely. But trauma informed practices mean that instead of just setting things up the way you want to set it up and then moving forward and plugging on along and assuming most of the people you're talking to or working with don't have trauma, and then if they get triggered or traumatized, you're like, oh, wait, okay, so there's someone here with trauma. That's not trauma informed. When we do trauma informed, we start by assuming that there are people who are engaging with our repositories and with our words and with our practices who have probably experienced trauma in a variety of ways. And so we start by assuming there's trauma there and being thoughtful and strategic about how we create systems that mitigate re-traumatization and vicarious trauma. SAMHSA has created this list of principles of trauma-informed care, and they include safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender sensitivity. We're not going to do as much with peer support today. I'd like to think that some of that is what's happening in this space right now. But we are going to be addressing some of the other ones specifically as they relate to what we mean by a trauma-informed repository. And we do want to remind us, be gentle with yourselves and be realistic. Our goal isn't that if you do trauma-informed practices properly, no one will ever be triggered by the content. That's just not realistic because different people have different experiences and different traumas, and that means they're going to have different things that trigger them. We may not know that someone is going to be triggered by an image of a particular kind of perfume, for example. That's not something we can anticipate, but we can anticipate that some broad categories like violence and oppression and racism are going to possibly elicit stronger activated responses in people. So we're not trying to account for every possible trigger. We're just trying to be aware that this is a thing that can impact people. Now, I want to just really emphasize that trauma-informed is an academic equity issue because academia has almost always told the stories of oppressed people and people who have been impacted, especially those who didn't have power, who've been impacted by traumatic experiences or mental health issues or certain kinds of oppression. Their stories have almost always been told in academia from the perspective of the oppressor or from the perspective of the person who had more power over them. research on people who have experienced complex trauma like me working as a survivor in the anti-human trafficking field. Research hasn't been done by people who have lived experience of that. It's been done by people on the outside, prioritizing this external gaze. And that means that a lot of these systems for how we do academic work, including research, including repositories, these norms have been set up by people who don't have that lived experience and thus might not share some of those same triggers. There's been some course correction, and this wonderful picture of Carter G. Woodson is a very long ago example of when we see some of that course correction really fighting to have a space in the movement. But we know, even given what we've seen at UNC here in the last few years, we know that that course correction is still very much needed and still in progress. It's not completed. But there's been a move to elevate the work of scholars from within marginalized or oppressed communities. What are they saying about their own community, their own histories, their own stories and needs? And in my kind of field, where we're looking at social work, public health, studies on oppression, psychology, there's a call in those movements for researchers who don't have lived experience to step back and make space for either collaborations with or foregrounding the work of people who have lived experience of trauma, have them be the ones doing the research and finding the solutions. So I partner on a lot of research projects related to sexual violence. I have a good friend who's at an Ivy League university as a Black man with a trauma history studying mental health and trauma and Black men. So we're starting to see a lot of us engaging in our own research about our own experiences. And that's to strengthen the field and also sort of helps us unpack our own experiences by putting them into historical context. But what that means is that a lot of these systems that were created for academic research, including libraries and repositories, these systems were designed to meet the needs of people who don't have lived experience. And we know people from marginalized communities have higher rates of trauma statistically because of that marginalization and pushing them out of access. We also know that impacted communities are best created to craft authentic narratives that don't center an external gaze, to conduct relevant research and develop meaningful solutions. And we think trauma-informed repositories can be part of the solution.
Yeah. So just to circle back, these are the principles of trauma-informed care: safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender sensitivity. And again, if any of the things that we're about to discuss ring a bell for you, where you see that you're doing a project that relates to one of these, I'd love it if you would share it in the Slack chat. So safety. This is more about allowing people to take their own internal temperature and decide for themselves what is safe for them. So when we're talking about safety with digital repositories, we're not talking about something that's paternalistic. We're not talking about wrapping them in bubble wrap or top down or protecting from information and resources. This is really about giving users autonomy, giving them the tools to navigate their needs in an empowered way, and trusting users to make good decisions for themselves. These are professionals, these are researchers, but they need to be empowered. They need to be given the tools to keep themselves safe. Trustworthiness and transparency. So what is inside the box? What's inside the pot? How can we let people know what it is they're about to consume? So part of this is, I know that there's been a long discussion in the cataloging realm about descriptions, but we need accurate descriptions applied at all levels of a repository. And that includes what is the overall repository, what are the individual collections in that repository, as well as the individual objects. And those need to be neutral and not be assigning value judgments. And from our point of view, part of that description is also like, does this contain content that we know tends to be upsetting for people or overwhelming, such as images of war, violence, racially charged imagery. And there are ways to do that that is not assigning a value judgment, that's just informational. Transparency are things like allowing users to see their own settings, being clear about what data is collected, if any. I think this is something that libraries and librarians are very aware of, but I don't know that we always communicate those things to our users. So we might be really careful about not collecting data about what user is looking at, what objects in our repository. But I think it's really important, especially in this sort of age of Facebook and other big data places that are collecting that information, to let folks know what data is collected, for what purpose, how it's de-identified, if there is a way to opt out of it, or if we're being really careful about not collecting data, let them know that, as well as letting them see if there are any settings that are affecting their search results or the display of their results. And also, what's the history behind this collection or repository? If we're doing some reparative work, some, correcting historic descriptions that aren't done yet, or there are things that we know are issues, but that we're still working on and weren't not done on yet, how can we be honest with our users about that and transparent about what they may see, acknowledge where we are now while also acknowledging the work that we still want to do. So collaboration and mutuality, all working together towards a common goal. So part of that is user feedback. And as a developer, I've seen some great processes of user feedback, especially on user experience. But how can we bring that user feedback earlier and earlier in the process, especially feedback from folks from impacted communities, when we have collections or repositories that affect those communities or contain works that are reference those communities. So how can we bring them into the process earlier, and how might we engage their feedback, not only in terms of user experience, but also in terms of descriptions? One suggestion that Cruz made that was very important to them was the idea of user image tagging. And the possibility of using predefined tags, such as violence or racism, and have catalogers be able to apply from a small list, but also allow users to suggest predefined tags for objects, especially within those areas that are more sensitive. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So I see this as very connected with the safety idea, but we're giving folks a map of where they might go. Where are there possibly dragons? Where is there a lake? And where is there like a river with a crossing? So we're not telling them where to go. We're just letting them know what's available, where, how to get there. So this is a default HIRAC show page. So this is actually NewRax, which is hosted by DCE, and someone has uploaded an example photo of a kitty cat. And I like kitty cats. Kitty cats are not at all upsetting to me. But if I want to know about a study in lorem ipsum, I'm first confronted by a full-size image of a kitty cat, or the image of whatever it is, before I've gotten to read the description. So this is above the fold. This is the show page below the fold. So this is where all the metadata is. But then there's also the thumbnail of the kitty cat. I'll let you imagine for yourselves, what if that image was something more activating or upsetting? It might be within my research interest, but maybe I don't need to see the image throughout the time that I'm trying to get the information about it. One idea that we had as a possibility was just a toggle. So this is a mock-up that has a show viewer button here. And you could have your whole repository default to having the viewer off. In this case, it's a universal viewer, IIIF viewer. And then if the user read the metadata and decided, you know what, I do want to see the image associated with this, they could click show viewer. And there it would be behaving just as it does in your standard Hyrax application. So you could set, this is something that you could decide to set on a collection level, on a repository level, but you could also maybe look at the user dashboard. And this is a mock-up that I made of what if the user themselves could say, you know what, just always show all the images, it's cool. Or they could say, you know what, I want to have that granular control over when I see the full size images. So this is just one idea of an intervention that we could do to bring down the amount of vicarious trauma that folks from impacted communities and everyone really could have, especially when researching difficult topics. So another of our trauma-informed principles is cultural, historical, and gender sensitivity. And this image is just really bringing together that idea that none of our identities are separate. Each of us has many different identities that interact, intertwine, and affect how we experience those other identities. So one aspect of this, and I know a lot of work has been done in this area, is metadata. I know the folks at the UNC libraries have been working on conscious editing, so updating descriptions of objects and collections. And I think one big part of this is engaging with people from impacted communities. Another aspect of this that I know folks have been working on is updating subject headings, not necessarily using the existing Library of Congress subject headings because they tend to lag a bit behind what our kind of cultural expectations are and what folks from impacted communities prefer. And so you can use local translations, local vocabularies to update those. So you have a little bit more control. You're still using a controlled vocabulary. You can still connect it to the Library of Congress, but yeah, be able to update it to reflect your user needs. And then another connection is, so this is a screenshot from the National Library of Australia. And first they acknowledge the First Nations peoples. And then I'll just read the cultural notification, which says, Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are advised that this website contains a range of material which may be considered culturally sensitive, including the records of people who have passed away. And I added the bold there. And then you have a choice to either enter the site or presumably having read this, you could choose to leave the site. And I think that this is a great first step. This is, this comes up as soon as you go to their website. But what if we gave users more empowerment and choice? So instead of just having the choice of entering the website or not entering the website, what if they could enter the website with all the images or enter the website hiding all the images or choose to leave? Just adding that one more layer of choice and empowerment could do a lot for impacted communities. And so now what? How might we implement this? And I know we're running short on time, so I might just point out that this is sort of, a lot of these ideas come from Agile, start small, don't feel like it has to be perfect to start with. Think about what are your highest impact collections, what might be most impactful to start with how can we incorporate stakeholders and how can we think creatively about who our stakeholders are. Earlier the better, roll it out slowly and iterate. So now I want to open it up for questions. Yeah, I also see Hannah Frost mentioning bringing in sensitive content from the Nuremberg trial archives and thinking about how to handle it. So yeah, I think there are definitely collections where this is would be really valuable. I'm not seeing like the Q&A. There are no open questions.
Thank you so much, Max and Chris. I will say that in the Samvera Slack, there have been a couple different institutions talking about this being an interesting approach and something that they want to start looking at. And I think that this is a great example of potentially, if there are several institutions who want to grapple with this at the same time, there could be a working group to see if we could move some of those options into the core code. So thank you so much for presenting this. This was fascinating.
Yeah, and I want to particularly, you may have seen me around in the community, but I really want to particularly thank Chris for sharing their expertise with us. They're kind of a big deal. So I also like them, but
thanks.
So, yeah, but I'm really grateful for you sharing your time with us today. Okay, I'm gonna run away now.
Thank you both so much. That was great. And yes, if you have any questions for Max, that Max could take on to Chris, then definitely put those into the Slack channel. Next up, we have